present you with a thesis, which is that world economic growth as we've known it is essentially over. We're talking about the economy tonight, but really we can't talk about the economy without talking about energy. For most of our history as a species, that the energy that we were using and the energy that we were exerting into the environment to get stuff done all was basically second-hand solar energy that was used and expended on an annual basis. We were growing plants and eating plants and burning plants to stay warm, and eating animals that had eaten plants and harnessing animals that had eaten plants to plows and so on. It was basically a renewable energy economy. Over the last 200 years, of course, that's changed profoundly. We found these amazing fuels that had been produced by nature over the course of tens of millions of years, highly concentrated energies. And they've changed the economy in a really profound way. This is the US economy. 1850, 65% of the US economy was run by muscle power of animals, another 18% by muscle power of humans. And only about 16 or 18% of the economy was fuel-fed machines. By 1960, muscle power doesn't even figure into the graph anymore. Why not? Is it because people aren't working anymore? No, it's because machines are just so much more powerful when they're running on fossil fuels. Well, imagine pushing your car 30 miles, which is the energy equivalent of 6 or 8 weeks of hard labor. Now, we get that service performed for us by a single gallon of petrol or gasoline, for which we in the US are only paying $3.50 right now, and complaining. That process of mechanization, of harnessing fossil fuels, has given us economic growth. This is GDP, gross domestic product. That's basically a measure of how much money is changing hands within the economy. And as you can see, there really wasn't much economic growth until the last couple of hundred years. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, money was essentially gold and silver. But with the enormous capacity of cheap fossil fuel energy to increase economic activity, there just wasn't enough gold and silver around to enable the levels of trade that could otherwise happen. So money gradually began to be reformed, first through fractional reserve banking, and then through complete fiat currencies that really aren't based on anything. I mean, the word dollar, for example, has no definition other than as the official currency of the United States. It's not tied to anything real. It's just an agreement between people who use dollars that these things have some value and will agree upon whatever that value is now. Tomorrow it may be a completely different value. But the significant thing about these new fiat currencies, they're expandable and contractible so that as trade expands we can create more of them. But the way we create them is through the creation of debt. Dollars, pounds, euros are all loaned into existence. Every time a loan is taken out, currency is essentially created on the spot. So that means that all of our money is tied to debt, and there is also the requirement for payment of interest on that debt. This works as long as the economy is growing. As long as more debt is being taken out, then that is creating more money with which the interest on previous debt can be repaid. So it's, in a way, it's a kind of a pyramid scheme. Today's debt is effectively underwritten by tomorrow's growth. If this enormous growth that's taken place over the past couple of centuries is riding on the back of fossil fuels, and we know fossil fuels are finite in quantity, and at some point they'll just start to run out, is this what the modern human reality experience is going to look like? You know, we know that the fossil fuel age will come to an end, but what else will ride down that curve with it? How much of what we enjoy and prize today as our modern way of life can we maintain absent fossil fuels? That's a very big question. In order for consumers to continue buying more stuff, something has to happen. If they're not making more money, and if the economy has to grow, and if we're constantly trying to talk people into consuming more so that the economy will grow, how's that going to happen? Well, it happens by people going into more debt. So people watch television, they have this image in their minds of what the good life is, what the proper consumer lifestyle is, what kind of car you should have, and cleaning products in your kitchen, and you know, a whole range of stuff. And of course, everybody wants to have that, but they actually can't afford to pay for it directly. So we have the explosion of the credit industry, credit cards, consumer debt. You can see a much, much larger share of GDP just coming from the expansion of debt. Just over the last few years, since 2000 or so, we've seen the largest credit bubble in history, and mostly taking place within the US, but in a number of other countries as well. The UK and Ireland participated, and some others, where house prices were rising. And so people were using the rising value of their homes as collateral to take out even more debt. Kind of inverted pyramid of debt where hundreds of billions of dollars worth of house prices translate into tens of trillions of dollars worth of securities and derivatives. Now, you would think some smart folks on Wall Street could have foreseen that the rise in house prices wouldn't go on forever, but you'd be surprised. Of course, it didn't go on forever, and the rate of foreclosures absolutely skyrocketed, then starting in 2007, 2008, and that pyramid really did come apart at the seams. $50 trillion, according to the Asian Development Bank, $50 trillion vanished from the world economy. In September 2008, the entire global financial system came within days of completely shutting down. So in order to avert that, the US Federal Reserve, US Treasury, and then subsequently other central banks and governments came up with these enormous bailout and stimulus packages. For the US, the bailout package amounted to more money than all of these other outlays combined. And we're talking about the Civil War, the Persian Gulf War, the Korean War, World War I, the Iraq War, the Marshall Plan, the New Deal, World War II. All of those together make up a smaller pie slice. Any growth that we've seen in the US economy over the last 2 years has been based on government spending. In the process of this happening, in the bailing out of the banks, in the creation of all these ludicrous debt instruments, credit default swaps, and so on, there was an enormous, historic amount of fraud going on. And the people who perpetrated this fraud are some of the wealthiest people on the planet. Should they go to jail? Absolutely. I mean, they were defrauding not only their immediate customers. In effect, they were defrauding the entire world because the rest of the world is paying for their crimes. There are factors outside the monetary financial system that mean that growth cannot resume. Since 2005, world crude oil production has been in a plateau. All responsible agencies like the International Energy Agency, the US Department of Energy, were forecasting that in 2010, 2011, the price of oil would be $20 a barrel. And in the worst case scenario, it might be $30 a barrel. What is it actually? In the US, it's $100 a barrel. Here, it's closer to $120. What's going on? This is the new normal, right? But even with those very high prices, actual global oil production has remained stagnant. We're in the general period of maximum world oil production. We've gone about extracting oil the same way we go about extracting all resources, which is the low-hanging fruit method. We take the easiest to get, the highest quality stuff first, and leave the nasty, hard to get, expensive stuff for later. And guess what? It's later. Every time we've had an oil price spike in the last 40 years, we have had a recession immediately following. Now, we have had at least one recession that did not result from an oil price spike, but we haven't had an oil price spike that didn't result in a recession. So realistically, the end of affordable air travel is within sight. It's not decades away, it's years away. Over the past few years, oil prices and food prices have begun moving almost in lockstep. This year, food prices are even higher right now than they were at the highest point in 2008. And what are we seeing? Revolutions in countries around the world as people decide that if they can't afford to eat, then what's the point of being cowed by despotic regimes anymore? They have nothing left to lose, quite literally. But if that's true, if fossil fuels are in the process of becoming more scarce as well as expensive, and if we're ruining the environment in the process of burning them, we obviously have to develop alternative sources of energy. Now, the assumption on many people's part is that we can do that and maintain economic growth. It takes energy to drill an oil well, it takes energy to build a solar panel or a wind turbine. So how much energy do you get back versus the energy that you invested? It has to be a positive return, or else the exercise isn't worth undertaking. And in fact, it has to be a sizable return if we want to have something like an industrial society. Remember back when we were all living in pre-industrial societies, most people had to work at energy production, i.e. as farmers, in order for the society to work, in order to support a small set of specialist classes, people who were being soldiers or accountants or kings or whatever. You only got to have a few of those, and most everybody else was just growing food. That's because the energy return on energy invested was pretty low. It was positive, but it was pretty low. With fossil fuels, the net energy gain was enormous. Historically, from oil and coal, we were seeing energy returns on the energy we invested in mining or drilling in the range of 80 to 1 or 100 to 1. That meant that only a few people had to work at food production and mining and drilling. The explosion of the middle class was effectively a result of high net energy from fossil fuels. Look where firewood is there at about 30 to 1. That's actually not that bad. We could run the society on firewood if only we had a lot more trees. But we'd run out of trees really fast, as Britain did, in the Middle Ages. So we need other things. Wind is almost as good as firewood, right? Not too bad. But then you start getting to natural gas, nuclear, solar panels, tar sands, biodiesel, and other biofuels. And it's a different kind of society. It's a society in which a lot more investment and effort have to go into energy production in order to make the society work. Solar and wind, great alternative energy sources, but they are intermittent. The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, and yet we want that energy to be there whenever we turn on the light switch. Energy is not the only limit to economic growth that we're starting to smash up against. There are also other resources that we're depleting very quickly. And some of this is a very short list, but these just happen to be a few things that are important to cell phones and computers and renewable energy technologies like solar panels and wind turbines, rare earth elements, for example. China has the market cornered, and China is now starting to cut back on exports of rare earth. And the big electromagnets in wind turbines require these rare earth elements. So what are we going to do? We have to find other sources. We have to use lower grade ores. Ultimately, we have to pay more. So that means less economic growth. Bees are disappearing. Well, who cares about bees? Well, we should all care about bees because they provide this essential ecosystem service of pollination. Without bees, then we have to, well, maybe we could hand pollinate all those, almonds and peaches and so on. But that means you have to pay people to go out and do that. Just 2010, we saw huge floods in Pakistan. Help me out here, Brazil, Australia, right. I mean, all of these added up to the tens of billions of dollars in damage. And some of these places will never be the same because they could not afford, really, to fund the recovery efforts. Pakistan isn't recovering from the floods, it's just limping along. But China's still growing at 10% per year, right? So how can you say economic growth is over? If China can do it, why can't everybody else do it? And if everybody else can't do it, well, at least we still have China pulling as the locomotive pulling the rest of the world along behind it. Really, China's economy is based on coal currently. And Chinese leaders are aware of this, and they're worried. They don't know how they're going to be able to maintain economic growth. What we have in China actually is this coal bubble. China's burning over 3 billion tons of coal per year, 3 times as much as the US. It's starting to import coal from Australia and Indonesia. Meanwhile, India wants to import more coal from Australia and Indonesia because it can't produce enough coal either. So there's more competition between India and China for the world's remaining coal supplies. That's going to drive up the price of coal. It's going to mean a lot more difficulty for China to maintain its economic growth. We have to get around this wall. And what is the wall? The wall is essentially of a monetary and financial nature. Because, as I was describing earlier, we have created a financial system and a monetary system that only function when they're growing. If the amount of debt ceases to increase, then that means the money supply starts to contract and it becomes a zero-sum game of more and more people, as the population grows, chasing after fewer and fewer dollars and pounds and euros and so on. When economic growth ceases, the whole system starts to seize up, and that's what happened in 2008. And that's why the governments and central banks of the world injected trillions of dollars into the economy to keep that system from seizing up. And their hope was that by doing so, they would prime the pump so that growth would restart itself. But it's not happening, and it can't happen. Why? Because there are too many people out of work, and people out of work don't consume and they don't take out loans. And resources are getting more expensive, and the costs of environmental disasters are going up. All of these things are converging at the same time to choke off what might otherwise be a normal recovery. Why isn't everyone rioting in the streets? Well, they are in some countries, it just hasn't gotten here yet. It's not going to be pretty. It's going to be a very difficult transition from a growth economy to an economy that isn't based on continual growth. If we're going to get around the wall, there's some things that are going to have to change. Our money is going to have to change. As long as we're relying on debt-based currencies, there is really no hope for a true recovery. So that means creating new currencies. Now, is this going to, are folks at the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve sitting around right now talking about this and figuring out a plan? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. I think that they're in a very reactionary mode. Fortunately, there are monetary theorists who've come up with some very good ideas of currencies that would function much better than debt-based money. Whenever there's a national currency failure, if there are local currencies already in use, people do much better. They have some other currency to fall back on, and trade can continue, at least in some fashion. So that's a really good incentive to get your local currency going and to support it. There are a couple of other ways of getting around that wall. One of which would be just for central banks or treasuries to create a bunch of debt-free money and give it away for people to pay their debts with. You know, we've got to get out from this debt overhang. We're not going to be able to pay back all the debts that exist. And all of that debt effectively represents claims on real stuff, on resources and labor. But there's not enough real stuff in the world to exchange for all of those claims, monetary and debt claims. So one way or another, a lot of those credit, debt claims are going to have to get wiped off the book. We have to build a sustainable society, a sustainable economy, one that can continue into the foreseeable future, that's not undermining the environment, the integrity of the environment. We would like to see this happen on a proactive basis, you know. We avoid the crash by doing all the right things now and going green and so on. But that hasn't really happened. And we're getting to the point where some of these crises are going to be happening regardless of what we're doing. We have economic theories that say the environment, the whole natural world, is just a subset of the economy. Those are natural resources that are inputs to the economic process, right? Now, of course, in reality, the human economy, all of it, is a subset of the environment. We're all citizens of planet Earth. We have to understand that growth in population and consumption is not sustainable by definition. We have to understand that renewable resources can only be harvested at less than rates of natural replenishment. Duh, I mean, it's obvious. Non-renewable resources, you know, we have to recycle them completely and reduce the rate at which we're harvesting them from the environment because, gosh, they deplete. And whatever wastes we produce from industrial production have to be either food for more production processes or food for natural processes. So we need to be measuring and targeting things like human happiness and well-being and the integrity of the natural environment. You know, we can't continue to have progress in the form of growth in GDP and continuing to try to aim for that and strive for it and struggle for it is just going to produce more frustration and heartache and political unrest. So what smart policymakers should be doing right now is moving away from GDP growth as an indicator and as a target and moving toward other targets. Even if we're putting solar panels on our roofs and we're bicycling to work and we're growing our own food in our backyard and we're involved in community organizations, and the reality is that there are going to be some speed bumps on the road immediately ahead of us. Resilience is a word that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with because it's embedded in the whole transition movement, which I think is an absolutely brilliant phenomenon on the world scene right now. It's all great stuff. It's still kind of at the fringes. You know, it's the early adopters. It needs to move beyond the early adopters. We need to get more and more people transitioning because this is going to be the sort of survival path, I think, for society as a whole. There is more up ahead than just, you know, strife and suffering. That if we do pull together as communities, there are things that we can optimize and maximize. These are all things that aren't at peak. I'm going to suggest that there have been 4 big transitions in human history up to this point. The harnessing of fire actually probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 million years ago that enabled us to alter our environments, and it even altered our own physiology because we started cooking our food and so on. That was a really big deal. Then language really made us human. You know, as a result of being able to talk, we started to develop concepts and categories and mythology and religion, and we learned how to lie as well as tell the truth, and all of these things that make us human came about as a result of language, which we just started using over the last several tens of thousands of years. Then agriculture, only about 10,000 years ago, the ability to grow more food than we actually needed at the immediate time we were growing it, so we could produce seasonal surpluses and thereby fund the development of full-time division of labor, which, you know, towns and cities and civilization come about as a result of agriculture. Huge change in the human condition. Then the most recent one, the fossil fuel industrial revolution, starting 200 years ago, arguably, give or take. Human population goes from 1 billion to 7 billion, planes, trains, automobiles, all the rest because of this huge, huge change in the human condition. I'm going to suggest that the sustainability revolution, which is what we've really been talking about in all of this, is just as important as any one of those. What we're living through right now is an absolute key development in the whole course of human history, and everything from here on will depend on how we do and what we do. Imagine life after economic growth in the best case scenario. Imagine what life without fossil fuels could look like if we really do everything right. And then imagine a path from here to there, and let's start building it as we go. Thank you very much.